Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the FIDO 101 pre-workshop at Authenticate Conference. Great to see everybody here. Welcome to all of you in the room today, and also those of you who are online, listening eagerly to hear all about FIDO. So, in this session, we're going to go really quickly through what FIDO is, who we are, and what we do. And then I'm going to hand over to my colleagues, who will introduce themselves as they come up, to really give a complete introduction to FIDO authentication and how it works. Go into a fair amount of detail in that session. And then we'll talk a bit about what we're doing in IoT and the specifications that we've recently published and what we're doing with them and how they work. We'll also talk about FIDO's role in identity verification. And then we'll cover FIDO Certified, all of our certification programs and what they mean to the industry. And then at the end, we'll wrap up with any final questions. So just to set the stage, most people, I think, have seen this statement. He was absolutely right. Definitely, passwords are not fit for purpose. He said this in 2004. Still 17 years on, we're all thinking and talking about this and trying to figure out a way to get away from it. This slide has got builds on it. Here's some statistics. It's a known fact that financial services have really been a target for hackers, and COVID has really only accelerated that over the past few years. Over 230% growth in attacks from February to April alone. The average cost of an attack is around $20 million. We could spend the entire 3 hours we have this morning talking about these types of statistics. It's kind of a known fact. There are many statistics out there. They're all pretty shocking. There's definitely an industry imperative to really rethink how we consider secure and easy-to-use login. So a fundamental shift is required from the legacy knowledge-based credentialing, which stored on a server, shared secrets. This includes one-time passcodes and includes also passwords. Very susceptible to common threats, phishing, hacking, all of those things that we're all familiar with. We need to move to the more modern possession-based credentialing, which is in your hand, it's on your device, it doesn't leave your device. It's never stored on a server. Using biometrics, a device PIN, and also passkeys. It's user-initiated and cryptographically secure. So FIDO's goal from day one was really to transform the market away from dependence on centrally stored shared secrets to a model that uses public key cryptography and allows consumers to authenticate through devices that they literally have in their hands. It's simpler and stronger authentication. The vision has been realized through several sets of specifications since 2015 and also has seen rapid deployment, but we can touch a little bit on that in a few slides. So here's a list of our board members. We have a pretty formidable board here, as you can see. A lot of big names, the major platforms, and a lot of very influential voices in the industry that can really help us shape how we move our mission forward. We also have close to 300 member organizations also participating in many of the work items that we do within the Alliance, which is not just writing specifications, also creating those certification programs that support the specifications, and talking about deployment challenges and success stories. Here you can see a partial list of some of the key deployments that we've seen around the world. And the great thing here is that you can actually see that there are some global companies included in this list. There's companies coming out of China, from Asia, and also, Europe and the US. So we have an ever-increasingly long list. This is just sort of a sample of some of those companies that were early adopters for the specifications and deployments. and are able to sort of successfully launch their products with FIDO certification, and indeed have great success. And some of these companies are here this week, and they will certainly be sharing their experiences and their case studies, so I'd encourage you to go and listen to their stories as they talk through how they got to where they are today. So we're kind of there, we're moving forward, we're seeing mass deployment of FIDO. What's next? We really need to think about making sure that we have that usability. So it's easy for consumers and employees of enterprises alike to really make sure that they are able to log in with a seamless process. So that's where we're really shifting our focus currently and moving forward to facilitating that user experience and providing guidelines around how to make that as seamless and simple as possible. And then there's passkeys. I'm sure many of you in the room and online here have heard that terminology. This really addresses usability and security challenges with account recovery. It also enables deployment of FIDO at scale to consumers moving between devices and upgrading to new ones. It's always a challenge when you have to re-enroll in everything as you buy your new phone. And it's also live. Both Apple and Google have implementations today, and Android and Windows will be following in the next year or so. So this is something that's real. It's happening today. And we will see an evolution of that. It's not something that's one and done. It will be something that will evolve over time as we learn more about the implementation, as we're able to support those implementations. And then we mustn't forget the FIDO security keys, which are ubiquitous today, also serve as an important alternative, especially for high security or enterprise use cases where there's a need for that much more control over what the user is doing. So that's my introduction. I'd now like to hand over to David Turner, who's our Director of Standards Development, and Scott Bingham, who's a Senior Product Manager at Microsoft, to really go into the details of FIDO authentication. So thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thanks for being here. Who's here at Authenticate for the very first time? Great, most of you. Who here caught David and I at the last session of FIDO 1 last year? A couple of you. I'm so sorry, the jokes are the same. I'm just not that funny. My name is Scott Bingham. I am a Senior Product Manager at Microsoft on their identity team. And I've been in the product space, consumer apps and services, for about the last 10 years. But only recently did I move over into the identity and authentication space. And it was a little overwhelming at first. There is an entire glossary of acronyms and terms and definitions to understand, new protocols and standards to be familiar with, and all of a sudden, there's bad guys on the other team who are trying to do very bad things, and you're kind of the frontline defense, and so there's a bit of that pressure there. And it was a little overwhelming. But what I soon found is that the authentication community is incredibly welcoming. And I think the reason for that is we're all trying to solve a very difficult, very important problem. And this problem transcends conventional lines. It's not just a problem for a lone IT admin. It's not just a problem for even a department or a company, an industry. It's a world problem. It is a human problem. And as our lives, both personal and professional, become increasingly digital, it becomes increasingly important to secure your data. And there's a lot that goes into data security, but authentication is really the front door. So all that is to say, welcome, super glad you're here. Hopefully this provides a good foundation for the rest of the week. This is truly an introduction, a 101 course. We're going to assume no prior knowledge, and hopefully we can give you a good foundation. So a couple goals for today. We're going to look at the authentication landscape, some of the current solutions that are out there, how the industry has adapted to threats, and where we are today. And then David's going to go and take us through some of the basics of FIDO. To start us off, and because we're at a conference called Authenticate, let's get comfortable with what we mean when we say the word authentication. And to do that, I'm going to use a real-world example, something I hope we're all familiar with, going through a security checkpoint at an airport. Maybe you did this even very recently. So I want you to imagine with me that you are in line at an airport. You have your passport, you have your boarding pass, and your little roller wheelie bag, and you get the privilege of waiting for 3 hours to get to your security line. You finally get there, and there's a friendly TSA agent, we'll call her Tessa, and then you're going to do this authentication dance, authentication ceremony, this process. And there's really 3 parts to it: ask, act, and validate. So Tessa wants to make sure that you, the person requesting access to this secure space, should have access to that space. And so the first thing that she's going to do is ask. She's going to say, I'd like to see your credentials and your boarding pass. So you give her your passport and your boarding pass. And then her next important step is the act. So sorry, that was her ask. Yours is the act to give those credentials. Her next important part is to validate. So her very important job is to make sure that your face matches the face on the passport, and that your name on the passport matches the name on the boarding pass, and that those credentials are good and valid and unexpired. See, it's kind of like this back and forth thing. Knock, knock, who's there? FIDO, FIDO who? FIDO 2. Bad FIDO joke. But it's just this back and forth. And if she's satisfied with that, she's going to take your credentials, she's going to hand them back, use her little fun light, and then you're going to go through. And that is authentication. So next time you go through a checkpoint, I want you to think about it. Ask, act, and validate. So let's talk about this in a digital context. The same 3 steps still apply: ask, act, and validate. But we authenticate far more frequently in a digital context than we do we go through TSA. You've probably already authenticated 50, 100, maybe 200 times today. You authenticate when you look at your phone and use Face ID or Touch ID or Face Unlock to unlock your phone. You authenticate anytime you type in a password. You authenticate when you use Windows Hello to sign into your Windows desktop. All of this is authentication. And there are lots of different ways that this can play out. You can have human-to-service authentication, but computers also talk to each other. You can have service-to-service authentication as well. So let's put a definition to this. There are a lot of ways to think about authentication. And if you ask 5 different people here, you'll get 5 different, very smart answers. But I like this one best. It says, authentication is a process of proving that the user with a digital identity who is requesting access is the rightful owner of that identity. So when we do that, we can control access to systems, applications, files, networks, and more. So remember, ask, act, and validate. So now that we have a fundamental concept of what authentication is, let's take a look at the current landscape. We'll explore some of the types of authentication that exist today, some of the inherent risks with those, and some of the things we've done to mitigate those risks. And we'll start with the most basic, the humble username and password. So since the dawn of computing, this has existed. We've needed a way to restrict access to data to certain people or groups of people, and we came up with this concept. A username, a piece of public information, and a password, a piece of private information that's supposed to be only known by the person who has it. And this has been around for a very long time. There's good reason for it. The first is that it's dead simple. You can spin up a website with a blank screen and 2 lines, 2 user input fields, and people are going to know how to interact with it. It's very simple. The other reason this is ubiquitous is because it adapts to different form factors very easily. You can put a username and a password field on a desktop. It can go on your mobile device. It can go on a calculator. People are going to be able to interact with it. But for all the virtues that passwords have, it has some serious shortcomings. And the first of which is that people love bad passwords. If you're at a conference like this, you probably already know that. Every year, these top the charts of the most commonly used passwords. Everybody from frontline workers to your great Uncle Don to tech CEOs are using 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and password. And there's reasons for that too. It's easy to remember. most people manage somewhere between 90 and 100 online identities. And the human brain can't physically retain and organize and categorize and recall complex passwords for 100 different online identities. So people use very common ones, very easy to remember ones. The problem is that if your password is easy to type and it's easy to guess, or it's easy to remember, it's probably easy to guess as well. And so there's some threats that come along with these bad passwords. And then one of the first ones is password spray. And password spray is when a very naughty person gets a list of usernames. And they go through and enter these usernames, and one at a time use these bad passwords and try to get in. So they'll go down the list: Cameron @ Anita @ Raj @ until this fool down here, Scott PB, put in QWERTY, it gains access. It's very simple to do. Which brings me to my favorite authentication quote: hackers don't break in, they log in. And so we see all these memes with these people in cool hoodies with matrix text running down their monitor. That's not what they're doing. They're typing QWERTY. They're getting usernames and typing in QWERTY. And if they've even taken one high school computer science class, they're writing scripts through this hundreds of times on hundreds of different websites all day long until they get in. And they do get in. So we as an industry realized that simple passwords simply don't work. So how did we respond? Well, we came up with some guidance. We said you can't just protect your entire digital life using a password that anybody can guess. We've got to do better than that. And so we came up with this: have 12 characters, have an uppercase letter, a lowercase letter, a number, a special character, no simple patterns, no previously username. Can't be your mom's name, can't be your dog's name, can't be your mom's dog's name or your dog's mom's name. None of those are okay. You've got to do better. And people started thinking about this and were like, okay, fine. So they came up with QWERTY 1. So that's not good enough. We've got to do something better. We want something like this. We also have some really interesting research that shows the device in which a person is enrolling their password also influences the strength of their password. So for example, if you have a desktop with a full keyboard, people are more inclined to create a password like this. But if you are doing it on a mobile phone, for example, and you have to get through 3 keyboards to find that special character, you're much more likely to create a weak password. We're renovating our kitchen right now, and I bought a brand new microwave, a smart microwave, which is dumb. I don't know why there's a Wi-Fi microwave. I'm not sure why it exists, but it does. And I wanted to try it out. And so they ask you to connect to your Wi-Fi. And let me tell you, entering a Wi-Fi password on a microwave is Dante's 7th circle of hell. It's just the worst experience you can imagine. So I'm going through there, and my Wi-Fi password is not simple. It looks something more like that. So I'm going through there, and about 5 minutes later, I get through. I've connected to Wi-Fi. I'm really happy about that. And then it asks you to create an account, because I didn't have an account for this particular thing. And there is an app you can do, but you can also do it online. So I was like, I'm going to try this the old-fashioned way on my microwave. And I put in my username, and I got tired of it. So you know what my password is? 123 defrost. And that's it. And so the form factor in which you're entering a password makes a difference. So now you know my microwave password, and I can yell at my son to put in my chicken nuggets, and I can yell at Alexa to microwave my chicken nuggets, which is, it's weird. But and if you hack my microwave, that's on me. But we gave all this annoying guidance, and people didn't respond. So what we did is we strong-armed them into this and say, you've got to do this. And so I'm sure you've seen the UX. You're enrolling a credential, and there's like these 8 different criteria. And as you meet the criteria, it turns a nice, pleasant shade of green. But if you don't get it right, there's a nasty red, and you can't create your password. It's super frustrating. And you create a slight variation of a password you've used before, and it's just all garbage. But even if you come up with a really great password like we wanted you to do, we found out pretty quickly that your password just doesn't matter. And I'll walk you through a few threats that we've encountered that proves that point. And the first is phishing. And phishing is simply when an unauthorized person gains access to your credentials through coercion or deception. And this can take a lot of different forms. For example, you've got email. I'm sure you've received an email from a foreign dignitary asking for your bank account information so they can send you some funds so you can send them back to them or something. I'm not sure how that all works. So you can free their impoverished country or themselves. Don't do it. There's also SMS phishing, also called smishing, which is kind of fun to say. And that's when you get a text message from someone like your power company saying, we need your account login or your password. to make sure your power stays on. Don't do that either. There's social engineering. For example, when a nasty granddaughter gets her grandma's password to her desktop to help get rid of her Yahoo toolbar or something, and granddaughter is actually just trying to get her password so he can try and log in her bank because she knows grandma's probably using the same password. We also have like fake websites when users or when bad people create look-alike websites. They're almost indistinguishable from the real website with a small tweak in the domain name, something that might even just be a typo. So people go into these websites and inadvertently give their username and login. People take those and log into the real website. So phishing is a real thing, and if you notice, all those are susceptible no matter what your password looks like. It can be QWERTY or it can be this monstrosity. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if your password is getting phished. Next concept we have here is password reuse. So let's say that I'm sitting at my job. I get an email from IT. It's been 90 days. I need to rotate my password. So I set aside an hour to do that. I go through and I create this password. It looks something like this, and I'm feeling really good about that. It's like I am, complying with industry best practices for these ugly passwords. And I say, if this is good enough for protecting this, I'm going to go update my bank password because I'm using a bad one there. I could do better. So they go and they use this password at their bank to protect the remnants of their 401k. And they say, well, if this is going to protect everything I've got left, this is going to protect my social. And there's a new social media company, MySpace, and they're going to go and create this password for MySpace too. And then in a moment of weakness, they click on an ad for myfreecrypto.com to supplement their disastrous 401k. And they type in a username and say, I need a password for this. No one's ever going to get my coin. They put it in there. Unfortunately, MyFreeCrypto does not have the best. Don't actually go there. I don't know if it's a real website or not. If it is, you shouldn't go there. And they use this password, and those people take that password and say, I think they're going to use that same password for MySpace. They go in, they log in, they find out where I live, they find out where I bank, they take the last $14 of my 401k, and then they find out where I work. And in the course of a weekend, I no longer have any friends, I have no coin, I don't have any money, and I lost my job, all because of password reuse. So you'll notice that happened with a very strong password. And what's tragic and interesting is this is very, very easy to do. In 2021, the largest password compilation of all time was leaked online, 8.4 billion entries. So even if you're super vigilant about the passwords you're using, even if you're not clicking on those malicious links, even if you're really good at teasing out phishing practices, there's still a really good chance that your password is out there floating around in the ether. You don't have to go to the dark web to get these. They're posted on Twitter all the time. It's dangerous out there. And so what we found, we looked at the data, is that 99.9% of breaches happen when the credential is protected by a password only. And so what did we do? We said, we've got to react to this. We need something else. The password is no longer fit for our digital lives. And so we came up with this concept called multi-factor authentication. It's called a lot of different things, MFA, 2FA, two-factor authentication, two-step verification. The underlying concept is all the same. We need something else to prove that the person with this identity requesting access should have access. Password is one factor, but it's likely that somebody else might have access to that password too, or they're using the same password, so we need something else. And you might have heard multi-factor authentication described as something you know, something you have, and something you are. So something you know, this could be a password. It could also be an answer to like a security question. Something you have. This could be something like an access badge, a security key, a software token, and something you are. This is something that's intrinsic to you, like your fingerprint, your face, a voice print, iris scanning, even heartbeat rhythms. There's different things, different innovative ways to prove you are who you are. And so when we have these three things, we have a stronger concept of authentication than just a password alone. So instead of just a username and password field like we've seen before, we have something that looks like this. We have a username, a password, and another field, like a one-time passcode that comes through your email or an SMS or your apps. But you'll notice we're kind of evolving here. At first, it was very simple, username and password. But as the threats grow, the user experience degrades. The security enhances a little bit, but the user experience is worse now. We have username, we have a difficult-to-type password, and then we have these other things, these other credentials to prove. So MFA is great. We found that it reduces compromise by 99.99%. That's fantastic news. However, it's also clunky, phishable, and can be slow with these traditional forms of MFA. SMS can be compromised by something called SIM jacking. If somebody has your email or your password to your email, they can get the email code too. So they're not perfect. There's also this concept of MFA fatigue. When you use an authentication app, you type in your password, and then a notification comes onto your app, and you press approve, and that's your second factor, right? But recently, there have been some high-profile attacks where an entire company was compromised because somebody accidentally pressed that, or they got tired of the constant notifications. A bad actor was sending them notifications over and over and over and over again. Approve, 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 and they're like, deny, 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 but it's like the 17th inning of a Mariners game. They're like, fine, leave you know, and they just press it. That's MFA fatigue. Got a story to tell you to illustrate this point. It's 1972, and my grandma decided she wanted to be part of a community bake sale. So she went to like a church or community center or something, and she brought my dad and my uncle with her. And she's sitting, in this group of ladies in their polyester and horn rimmed glasses for like an hour, and Dad starts getting bored. He says, "Mom, can I go home? Can I go home? Can I go home? Can I have the keys? Can I have the keys? Can I have the keys?" And she says, "No, no, 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 no. Stop asking, stop asking." And he goes on and on. Finally, he said, "Fine, take the keys. Just go." So he's feeling really good about himself. So he takes the keys, takes his brother, and they start driving home. But Dad's 9. And so there's a little bit of a problem here. So it's lucky he didn't kill himself or didn't kill anybody else, but inevitably he gets pulled over, and the police officer knocks on the window and says, "I sure hope there's somebody else in that car with you." And then little brother pokes his head out, who's 7 years old. And the police officer was not very happy with Ellen, and Ellen was not very happy with my dad, but Ellen learned a very important lesson about MFA fatigue. So be careful about that as well. So we came up with this little graph here that shows what we have. This is our authentication landscape on 2 axes. On the y-axis, we have ease of use. On the x-axis, we have security. So up in the far, far upper left, very easy to use, very insecure, we have passwords. We enforce these complicated rules about creating complex passwords. It gets a lot more difficult to use, not much more secure, because we talked about how your password really doesn't matter. So now we come into these other forms of MFA. We have password and email code, SMS code, app codes or app notifications. So we're kind of improving the experience a little bit, but it's also very difficult to use. So we have this space up here, this innovation space. How can we create something that's both easy to use and incredibly secure? But we're not the only people looking at this. And so there's 2 other things that we have to think about when we're creating a new type of credential. It has to be interoperable. Whatever we come up with has to work everywhere that passwords work today. It's got to work on your desktop. It's got to work on your tablet. It's got to work on my microwave, right? It also has to be trustworthy. And how do we do that? How do we make? And I'm sure if you're in admin, you've been approached by some third party says we have this perfect authentication solution. How do you really know what's going on under the covers? How do you know that it's trustworthy? And we can solve these things with something called a standard. It's ironic, but there's no standard definition for a standard, but I like this one. A standard is a repeatable, harmonized, agreed, and documented way of doing something. So to take this out of the abstract, let's use another real-world example. It's October 15th, and for some strange reason, it's 88 degrees in Seattle, and you've got a real hankering for a razzmatazz smoothie. So you get out your Vitamix or your Blendtec, whatever team you're on, and you take the frozen fruit, your juice, you put it all in there, you switch it on, it blends up, and you've got a really great smoothie. But think of all the places that standards make that happen. So you've got these blades, these razor-sharp blades, rotating at 3 trillion revolutions a minute, and you never worry about them flying off because the nut and the bolt are standards. They have a certain thread count, they have a certain torque setting to make sure that blade is safe. And you reach for the plug and plug that in, you're confident you're not going to get shocked because it's a standard gauge thickness in the wire that's protected by a standard covering on the wire, and the plug itself is made out of a certain material and certain measurements, so I can plug it in any outlet in the United States and it works fine. And the power that comes from the hydroelectric dam and is stepped down arrives at my house at the appropriate 120 volts, and I plug it in, and I don't get blown up, and my smoothie doesn't get blown up. All that happens because of standards. And we have some standards in technology as well. We have Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, USB, HDMI. All these are standards. And they allow us to work together. And imagine the chaos if you had one laptop manufacturer who had Wi-Fi and another laptop manufacturer had FiWi. Two different ways of sending and receiving radio signals. And then the third manufacturer comes up with their own proprietary solution. You couldn't build routers for this. There's no way you could manage it. And you couldn't ensure the security or the safety of it. And so the standards allow us to be safe, and they also give us economies of scale. When everybody's working off the same thing, it comes cheaper to produce hardware as well. So let's take a step back and look at our original ask here. Where do we go from here? We have this authentication landscape. We know passwords don't work. We know complicated passwords don't work. We know there are some other solutions with traditional types of MFA that are a little bit better, but also are not perfect. We need something that's secure, that is easy or easier to use than a password, it's interoperable, and it is trustworthy. And with that, I'm going to hand over to David to walk us through the basics of FIDO.
Thank you, Scott. Am I on? Yes. All right. Hello. Welcome. So, let's start talking about FIDO itself. Jumping right in. So, Scott already talked about the ask, act, and validate model. The traditional one that we've been having today, aligning with the whole password model, is you're asked with this login form, you act by typing in username, password, and then the validate is this really trivial bit of code that just does simple compare of the values that you've stored previously. That's it. And I don't need to get into all the problems that Scott discussed previously. The big change with the use of FIDO is that it takes a big part of that away from the user and builds it into a common set of APIs that are now integrated within the browser itself, that the relying party or the service provider can take advantage of, so they don't have to paint their own little same screen anymore and gather the information. We've got now some APIs that simplify the process. The act portion becomes some kind of human gesture. It might be just touching a key, it could be fingerprint, it might even be facial recognition. So it's not so much a gesture, but still, it's an interaction of some sort. And then the validate, I'll get into this in more detail, is no longer simple string comparisons that are easily phished and hacked off servers. Instead, we use cryptography and key pairs to be able to secure the process. So that, again, I'll get into detail in a bit, but nothing gets left behind, and there's nothing to steal during a phishing process. So let's walk through the different steps. So today, the model we have, was the earlier one with the act and ask. You've got the user, you've got the computer, and it's a direct interaction between them. The biggest change with FIDO is suddenly now we've introduced this thing called an authenticator, which is a trusted component that's either an external security key or it could be built into your phone or your laptop or your tablet. And it now becomes the primary intermediary between you and the service provider, again, using public-private key cryptography, which again, I'll get into in a little bit. So the idea then is that when the relying party wants to set up a new account for this person and set up a new authenticator for them, the user is always required to participate. So whether it's creating the keys or using the keys later, it always requires some kind of either user presence or user verification in order for the key to take any kind of action, creating the key or using the key for validation. So the user interacts with the authenticator, and that sets it up. Once it's been set up, and you go to do the authentication, then the challenge comes, the challenge goes to the authenticator. The authenticator then goes back to the user and says, hey, tell me it's okay, touch, fingerprint, PIN could be, that then says to the authenticator, yep, the person's there. The authenticator then uses the private key that it's got, signs the response, and sends it back to the relying party. And the beauty of this is that there's no passwords that are being sent over the air. There's no passwords being stored with the relying party. And so all of the phishing models that And server breaches that Scott described are nullified, right? Those things can't be attacked. And by using this mechanism as well, if the challenge uses a unique key, it also protects against repeat relay attacks. That's the word I wanted. So, how do these factors all work together? So, what we've got is a collection of bits that are assembled to help make all of this work. We got some standards. I've already used the word relying party. There's the authenticator, gesture, asymmetric cryptography, and protocols, which I didn't get into yet, but that's how the things talk. And so I'm going to go into these terms in a little more detail. So first, what's the relying party? Well, that's the service provider. It's the bank. It's the social network. It's the enterprise portal. Right? It's the thing that's providing some kind of service or information or content to some kind of user. What's the authenticator? Well, again, that's the component that provides the cryptography and does the cryptographic processing that enables the mechanism that I showed. They come essentially in two flavors. There's what's called the platform authenticator, and this takes advantage of cryptographic mechanisms that are built into a device, whether it's a tablet or phone or your desktop, laptop. And then there's what's called a roaming authenticator, and this is a different beast where it's something that you can carry around with you that's separate from the device that you may have set it up with. And so you can actually use the same key, whether it's a watch or it could even be one built into your phone. It means you can then take that authenticator to other computers and get the same benefits with that one security key that you've set up. So what's a gesture? Well, I've already talked about all the different types of gestures. The idea is that it's some kind of recognizable, clear interaction from the user. It could be a biometric thing. It could be a PIN. It could be, in some cases, just touching a key if all you need to indicate is that there's literally a warm body present, because it's usually a capacitive thing. And so there's a large variety of them. And the idea is that the system needed to accommodate all these variations because there are so many different environments in which people will interact. I keep hearing about all these scenarios where people are wearing these big honking gloves. How do they interact and take advantage of this when they can't necessarily do certain gestures? And so the notion of the gesture often has to be adapted to suit the environment in which the FIDO authentication is taking place. But the beauty of FIDO is that the mechanism of the gesture is independent of the use of the authenticator, as in you can use whatever gesture you want, whatever biometrics you want, in order for this to work. Now, the heart of FIDO at a technical level is what we call asymmetric cryptography. And the idea is that this is using something called public and private keys that is a very well-established cryptographic mechanism that's used throughout the computer industry today. Pretty much all authentication, cryptography, signing systems that are out there are using some kind of public key cryptography. Now, you'll notice in the title it says public key, PKI, without the infrastructure. So PKI means public key infrastructure. And this is part of the simplicity of FIDO. FIDO doesn't require the use of big certificate authorities and management of certificates and expirations and renewals and reissuance. There's still a need for that in certain scenarios, but for the more simple case of doing authentication, it's not necessary. We can take advantage of the value you get from public-private key pairs in order to achieve what we want. So in the model that I described earlier, you've got the client, they've got a private key, you've got the server, which holds the public key. And again, the public key is a useless piece of information all by itself. I could give that, my public key for a particular site, to everybody in the audience, and it'll have no value to you. You can't do anything with it unless I sign something with my private key, and then you'll know that it came from me, but that's all that you'll know. So in the protocol that takes place with FIDO is that you've got a message that gets sent to the client uses the private key to sign that message and gets sent back. The server has the public key. It can then verify that it actually came from the private key that originally created it. As I said, it doesn't get into all the certificate management and so on. That's often the case. You can see examples at the bottom of the screen, secure SSL. That uses the full-blown PKI, but again, the heart of it is this public-private key pair notion. Decentralized identity, Bitcoin, all of them rely upon the use of public-private key pairs in various ways. So again, this is one of the most well-established mechanisms for doing cryptography and signing in the computing model. There are lots of others, of course, but this is really sort of the core of how many things are done right now. So, what are the specifications? Scott talked about standards. Scott talked about having them being written down. Well, that's a really key part of it. If they're not written down, how does anybody know that they're doing the same thing? So, we've got a couple of different specifications that make up what we call FIDO2. The first is a specification called WebAuthn, and based on input that came from the FIDO Alliance a few years ago, there was a working group formed within the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, and it designed a standardized interface in the browser. And the idea then is that the mechanisms for doing all of the signing and the crypto stuff takes place within the browser. Previously, if you wanted to implement a solution like this, there were two problems. The first is it had to be in JavaScript and you'd have to write your own because there was no standard for it. So you could write a FIDO-like thing, and in fact, everyone could have even agreed on how to do it by writing it in JavaScript. Oops, JavaScript is really vulnerable, right? You download something to the browser, it's very easy for that script to get hacked. By taking a set of standardized APIs and building them into the browser, you've solved two problems. The first is it's standardized. So a relying party knows, here are the calls, the programming calls that I have to make to create a new credential. Here are the calls I need to make to authenticate using a given credential. There's just a couple of basic interfaces, and that's how it works. So the first is it's simpler for relying parties to implement because you can have common code bases, you can have common libraries, they all know how to talk to this. The second benefit is that you've taken the risk out of the crypto stuff that's important out of JavaScript, which can be hacked, and you've put it into the browser. Clearly, we've already got an inherent trust in the browser. We already use it to do a lot of all of our financial transactions and even logging into high security portals and stuff. We're still using the browser. So people say, well, you got the crypto in the browser. Can I really trust that? Well, yeah, you can because you already do. But what it means though is that it is protected. It is being executed in a safe space, and that's something that the relying parties can rely on. Is that that to the extent the system is already protected, if your operating system's been hacked, then you're toast anyway. But this makes it a more reliable, more robust environment. The second specification is called CTAP, or the Client to Authenticator Protocol. One of the things I didn't cover earlier was the notion of this security key, what I called the roaming authenticator, and in fact, even the other devices, say a phone or a watch. How do they interact with, say, a laptop that I want to log into? Well, CTAP defines mechanisms for using USB, Bluetooth, or NFC as the way for a roaming authenticator, say a watch, or say a USB-based security key, to talk to the operating system. And the idea here is that it, again, standardizes the interface for that hardware to talk to the other machine so that the people that build the authenticators just have to write to one protocol, right? Everybody can write to the same protocol. And again, you get the benefits of it being more secure because it's consistent. It means there's lower engineering costs, and you get higher interoperability or better interoperability because everyone's writing to the same interface. That means you can probably take the same keys and use them across other devices without having to worry about whether it'll work or whether it won't. came to the same slide twice. Nope, that's the laser pointer. That's better. So how does that all look? Actually, I guess I should go back. These are essentially, CTAP is in fact a protocol. Protocol is a defined set of steps when two parties want to talk to each other. It defines the specific pattern of messages that have to go back and forth, how they're called, what are the responses, and so on. And I mention that because now I'm going to use protocol on this particular diagram. Some say that WebAuthn is not a protocol, that it's a set of APIs, but in practice, it's being used in the context of an authentication protocol. So people often refer to WebAuthn, even though it doesn't define the protocol, they refer to it as a protocol because, again, it gets used in the same basic notion of create a credential, then get the credential to do the cryptography. And the patterns for doing that are well understood and very well defined. So what you can see here is the example.com, that's your relying party. You've got WebAuthn that sits between the client and the relying party. You've got the public and private keys that go between them. And WebAuthn is the mechanism that is used there. And then CTAP at the top on the left, that shows how, again, you have a protocol that talks to an authenticator where there's some kind of gesture that unlocks the information that's in there. And I just realized that I left out a really, really, really important fact. I apologize. Going back to my diagram, and I don't think I can do that quickly and easily. Let's see if I can do that. It's a really important anti-phishing thing. One more. There we go. A very, very important part of this, and I apologize profusely for missing this. One of the examples that Scott talked about when he was talking about the anti-phishing aspects of it, that's another inability to the fact that stealing the code or stealing the signed things isn't inherently useful. The other thing is that there's an ability, or there's an aspect of the FIDO protocol built in that actually blocks phishing attacks during the process. So take, for example, you go to the website or you get an email from a website, says there's a problem with your Microsoft account, and what you don't notice is that the O in Microsoft is in fact a 0. So you click on it and you start following the process. Well, if it asks for, as soon as it says, okay, I want you to now authenticate, it knows, let's say you've got a FIDO authenticator, I want you to authenticate with your FIDO credential, as soon as it asks, the request is going to fail. Because an important part of the whole FIDO protocol is that when the key was created, in that very first step, part of what was stored in the key information, was the fact that it was from Microsoft.com spelt properly. When the request comes from the other site with the 0 instead of the O, it gets compared and it immediately fails because they don't match up. So the domain that created it, so the name of the relying party there on the far right, is embedded in the credential. So if somebody does try to phish you by giving you a weird website name that looks very much, enough like a legitimate site that you don't catch it, it still won't allow you to do the authentication. There's nothing that can be passed on. You can't force the authenticator to do the signing because it's immediately going to catch that this request came from a website that you don't have a key for. So that's a really, really important part of it. Can't believe I forgot that. Let's see if there's a fast way to progress through here. So, right. So there's two experiences in general that you'll find with FIDO, just to kind of start summing up here. There's two models that you're going to find in the FIDO space. The one is the use of FIDO as a second factor. So today you've got the username password model. You might have like an SMS OTP, right? That's a two-factor model. You got the password and you've got the SMS going on. FIDO can be used in that same environment where instead of using the SMS message or the email code that you get, you can use an authenticator key. And so in that model, after the password's been entered, you then get challenged for something else, which in this case is the key. You put in the key, and the authentication takes place. That's, in fact, the model that's been, that's the main model that FIDO's been used in for quite a few years now. What's it evolving to, though, now is one where it becomes a single gesture experience, where we're now moving to a model of passwordless experiences, password-free or passwordless authentication, where the authentication challenge comes, the authenticator is built into your device, tied to, say, your biometric. So I've got a Windows laptop, and I use my camera for that, and for me, the experience is great because it pops up, it sees me, and I just say, okay. So the authentication, the ask is, being sent to the browser. I want to authenticate. It recognizes that, oh, this just needs some biometric from the guy. I touch, I takes my picture, whatever, and it goes to authentication, which is the validation. When you start hearing about passkey more, this is primarily the model this is the context of the model in which passkey is used. It's this passwordless based experience. And I haven't really gotten into the use of passkey today, mainly because there's a bunch of other sessions that are coming in the next couple of days where they'll go into a lot more detail. I can give you the simple description, which is passkey is this, right? When you look at how does the authentication work with passkey, it's everything I just described. There's nothing new about the authentication aspects of passkey. The flows that I described, the cryptography that's used, it's the same thing. Passkey is essentially a FIDO credential. The newer part of it is the fact that, as Christina showed in one of her slides in her presentation, there's an ability now to either synchronize or back up those FIDO credentials so that they can then be moved to another device, whether for recovery or for synchronization across devices. So I wanted to focus here and not drill down into passkey, because as I said, Scott, in fact, is going to be doing a presentation later on this. Not today, probably tomorrow or the day after. There's a couple of them specifically about passkey, and there's a good chance you'll hear references to it in other presentations. So, FIDO Advantage. You saw this slide already. It's secure. It uses the public key cryptography. It's easy to use. It now becomes a single gesture. It's interoperable because of the standards, and in fact, not just because of the standards being written and defined, but as Paul will talk about in a little while, we have certification, both interoperability testing as well as security testing, so that you know the things that are being built out there are actually being written to follow the standard. So that adds a lot of value to the relying parties who are trying to build systems, because you don't want to have to worry about who's authenticator, which platform, right? The more interoperability we get, the easier it becomes. And then trustworthy is because of all those things built in. There's less chance of a user doing something wrong because it then becomes a simple gesture. You've got the security built in and you've got the interoperability. So the whole model just works a whole lot better. Secure by design, again, the unique credentials, phishing resistant, asymmetric key pairs, standardized. Realize I'm repeating what I just said on the other code, or the other slide. No more passwords to worry about in most situations. And by the way, username and password are not going to go away. We absolutely recognize that. And that's partly why the two-factor authentication aspect of FIDO will continue to exist for a long period of time as well, because it's a model that suits certain environments. Again, the easy to use, you don't have to be switching apps or going to email. I told a story another time fairly recently where I wanted to log into a website and I hadn't been there for a very long time. So I said, oh, we haven't seen you in a while, so we're going to send you a code by email so that you can prove who you are. Well, guess what? It tied to an email account that I hadn't used in a very long time. So I went to the email and tried to log in. Guess what? It wanted to send a code to another email address that was the one that I actually used. So I had this huge chain that I had to follow through, and it was a real pain. And again, the simplicity, you're not even worried. I mean, one of the problems is not just forgetting passwords, but typing the darn things, right? Did I do a capital F there? Is it a lowercase f? Like, you know, fat fingers on the keyboard. You're always messing those things up. Interoperability, it's in all the major browsers. It's on all the major platforms. It works across all types of devices. So it's just there, right? Again, someone building a solution, the tools are there. They're built into the operating system. You don't have to worry about, if you want to write a FIDO solution, whether or not the devices out there can support it. Be fair, much older devices may not be able to support it, but generally any device sold today, and even over the last few years, has the ability to work. And from an end user standpoint, it works on any device that they have, right? They don't have to say, oh, I need to switch from Android to iPhone in order to get FIDO support. No, it works on whatever device you've already got. And then back to the trustworthy part, there's got the standardization aspect. I did forget to mention, boy, forgetting bits and pieces here, the biometrics never leave the device. When you do, say, a fingerprint reader in order to access, or facial recognition like I described on my device, the pattern matching and the gathering and comparison, the templates, those stay on the computer that created them. They are not shared with the particular website. I was talking to one of our tech fellows here just this morning, and he was saying that they've done this conference now for us for a couple of years, and he learned that he was afraid to use his fingerprint to authenticate to Facebook because he thought he was giving his fingerprint to Facebook. In fact, that's not the case. The fingerprint stays locally on your machine and is simply used to tell the authenticator, yes, it's okay, you can share my key or use my key to communicate with that site. And again, there's no more need to share. I don't have to give my email for recovery. I don't have to give my phone number in order to get the extra keys. So at that point, before we move on to the next one, do we have any questions?
David, we actually have a question online, which came in, I think, when you were talking about the public key cryptography.
Yeah.
For domain checks, does that mean that parts of the key are unencrypted?
Parts of the key are unencrypted. I'm not sure I understand the question, because the key is used for either signing or encryption. The flow is that a challenge is sent from the relying party to the authenticator. The authenticator then signs that challenge using the public key that the authenticator has, and that's returned to the relying party. The relying party can then use the public key that they were given during registration to confirm that the signature was created by the associated private key. So I'm not sure if that answers the person's question or not. Do we have anyone else here? Someone way at the back. Sorry, I couldn't quite hear you. Could you come a bit closer or a bit louder? So the question is about as native apps become more widely used, can FIDO be used there or in web apps? Because right, so some native apps use a web interface in order to do things like authentication. Is that what you're asking? Yes. So the short answer is yes. You can actually do FIDO authentication directly from within the app. The APIs are available on the actual platforms themselves, Apple, Android, Windows. So the native app can make the call. But for consistency, it's often easier if you've already written the authentication interfaces to talk to a browser. Well, you can just do the same thing, except now it's in the mobile browser space. And so it becomes then an embedded window. That's improving, let me say. It depends, at this point, it depends a little bit on the platform, and the reason has to do largely with security models. The model that I talked about earlier, where you need to make sure that it's the right domain, there's challenges about doing cross-domain access and requires getting into more detail. But the short answer is yes, that's definitely something that's it already exists, but it's being improved on both iOS as well as Android.
A couple more online, David.
Oh,
Sorry.
go ahead. We'll take this first. The replay attack is actually based on the use of the nonce that comes from the relying party. So it creates some random value that is sent by the relying party. That's then sent back, and it partly depends on the relying party to recognize the nonce has already been used. Well, they can't replay it elsewhere. They can only replay it back to the place that it was used. If they try and replay it, it will already have been used and therefore will have expired, right? The relying party would know that that nonce was used because each request sends a new value. It's not the same value. So it sends some random number value. So if it's already been used, it can't be used a second time. It can't be used for a subsequent authentication. Online?
How does account recovery work when users lose a FIDO device like a YubiKey?
So actually going to be getting into that 2 presentations from now to some extent. The short answer is that the FIDO protocols have nothing built into them to deal with account recovery. That's an external component that needs to be built on in a complete system. I'll be talking a little bit about one approach to that. I will say that this is a big part of the value of passkey, because passkey, again, passkeys can be backed up, but they can be synchronized. And so you still need to do an account recovery process, right? If you've lost your phone that has all your keys on it, you still have to go to the process of proving to whoever's holding them for you that you are who you are. So the in-account recovery, you still have that process. Once that's been done, the keys can be recovered using passkeys.
Who's keeping the map of the public key to the relying party/server?
Say it one more time.
Who is keeping the map of the public key to the relying party/server?
Who's keeping the what?
The map.
Map. The relying party is the one. So part of the process, again, I'm not getting into all the technical details here, but part of the process of creating your key pair is that what's bound to it, I already mentioned, is the domain name. To help prevent phishing, but it's the domain name, it's the device name, and it's the user ID, or the authenticator identity. So these 3 pieces of information are generally bound together, and it's information that's provided from the authenticator back to the relying party. So the relying party has all of that information, is managed by the relying party. Yes? So the question is, are there any mechanisms to prevent against attacks on the hardware where the authenticator is? So the answer is maybe, and it depends upon the strength of the key. And you can have authenticators that go all the way from software-based all the way up to hardened hardware. And again, as Paul will talk about later with our certification program, we actually do certification of various security levels so that an authenticator vendor can say ours can defend against attacks of this type, all the way up, as I said, to hardened hardware where it requires literally cracking open the hardware and using oscilloscopes and stuff to figure out the pattern. So yes, there is a model for that. It's not part of the protocols, but as a part of building the ecosystem, we've developed certification testing to address that. Yes? No, so the question is, if I've got a public key, can't relying parties track me across multiple sites? The answer is no. For every site that you register with, a unique key pair is created. So when I log in, when I register a FIDO key with my bank, I create a public-private key pair there. When I log in with, say, my eBay account, that's a unique public-private key pair. There is nothing in the key information that would allow eBay and my bank to know that I'm the same person based on the public keys. There's no data. I mean, if they're really colluding, they can get other information. But the public keys themselves are always unique per service provider. So that can't be a basis for collusion. Oh, we got one online.
The example on the example used regarding Microsoft, how does a system check between a fake domain versus the domain signed within the key if parts of the key aren't visible?
Let's try that one more time.
So using your Microsoft example,
Yep.
how does the system check between a fake domain versus the domain signed within the key if parts of the key aren't visible?
So it's embedded in the extra key material, and it actually takes advantage of the use of secure HTTP, which prevents that to do the detection and defense against cross-domain attacks. Way at the back. Yes. So the question is, CTAP currently supports USB, BLE, Bluetooth, and NFC. Are there plans in the future to support other modalities or other protocols? The quick short answer is yes, and I'll get into details in a second. Zigbee, probably not, just because it's not likely to be a protocol that's used in the context of keys and so on. If there was a demand for it, absolutely, we would look at doing it, but I don't see that coming just because of the way Zigbee is generally being used. Although now that I say that and I'm thinking about it, maybe. But at this point, there's certainly not demand for it. The yes part is that as a part of what we're rolling out with, or being rolled out with Passkey is this other component, which we call cross-device authentication. And the model there is that if I've already created a key with my bank on my phone, pretend this is a phone, and then I want to log into the same bank on my laptop and I haven't created the key there yet, there's now an ability for the site to pop up, a QR code, where I can then take a picture of that with my phone. That initiates this sort of mechanism that uses a combination of protocols to communicate between the device and the phone, as well as to do back channel to the server. So it's a combination of protocols that are used to do that authentication. You then authenticate on the phone, which then back channels to the site and lets you in. For those who are geeky and are going to look at the actual CTAP 2 protocol, which is currently under development, you'll see this referred to as the hybrid protocol. So NFC, BLE, USB, and hybrid. And we call it hybrid because today it's Bluetooth and others. It could well be, God, what's the new Wi-Fi short range? Whatever it's called, I apologize. So the question is, can third parties extend the protocol? And the simple answer to that is no. The specification is currently defined by the FIDO protocol, by the FIDO members, which, as you saw, is a pretty extensive group of companies. How are we on time?
Good, we've got another 5 minutes or so.
Okay.
Another question online: how should relying parties authenticate users if the user uses a device that doesn't support FIDO yet?
All the same mechanisms that you have available today. So if you don't have FIDO available to you, then you can use whatever is already available for that device. It may be one-time passcodes. It may be all you've got. It may be using some kind of smart card with a smart card reader, depending on the device that you've got. There are other mechanisms that are out there today, and you would just use them as you would if FIDO didn't exist. Yes? Is there a mechanism to allow passkey providers to register? Is there a mechanism for someone other than the platform to be able to create and provide passkeys for authentication? Sort of. So you'll hear a lot about passkey this week in a number of different sessions. This is the first iteration of the implementations for that. There are some limits on it, but the idea that, say, the password managers that are already out there could play that role is absolutely one of the long-term goals. So while the ways to do things today don't make that very easy, it is absolutely on the roadmap of the platform vendors to make that a possible thing. So in future, it may not be the authenticator that's built in, it may not be the TPM in my Windows machine. It could be some third-party solution that's, say, provided by my enterprise that would allow me to do that instead of using the built-in laptop capabilities.
So we have a couple more questions online, but before I go there, I see there are a number of questions coming in related to passkey. I think I would suggest that the people who are asking those questions hold them until the end of the week.
Yeah.
Because there are going to be multiple sessions on passkey this week where hopefully those questions will get answered. If you still haven't got an answer by the end of the week, please feel free to reach out to FIDO Alliance, info@fidoalliance.org, and we'll happily respond to those questions at that point in time. But other general questions related to FIDO, the basic authentication, where are the public keys stored if CAs are not required? Certificate authorities are not required.
So the public keys are stored, the relying party stores the public key. They hang on to it. So when the registration process happens, the relying party makes the request to the authenticator to create a key pair. The authenticator creates the key pair, holds on to the private key, and as a part of the response, along with things like the authenticator ID and the user ID, gives this bundled response, including the public key, back to the relying party. So the relying party is always the holder. Now, how they manage it, right, that's out of scope for what FIDO does, but it's ultimately the relying party that keeps and manages and looks after the public key.
And then the final question, and then we should move on. Is there alignment between FIDO certification levels and NIST credential level of assurance levels?
So that's a tricky question. The simple answer is sort of. So the NIST has a special publication called 863-3 that talks about levels of assurance for identity assurance, for authentication assurance, and for federation assurance. And they've got levels 1, 2, and 3, and they define a number of criteria for you to meet those different levels. Separate from that, you have the authenticator security levels, which talk about how hard is it to steal the private key. That's the simplest description of what the security levels represent. Paul will probably get into more detail, but that's the very simple notion of it. So they don't really align directly, but within the 863-3, and by the way, the -4, I think we have someone presenting about it this week. I hope I'm not lying. Is just about to be released. And in 863.3, though, they talk about second factor authentications in authentication assurance level 2. The big difference to -4 that's coming along is that they're now making a distinction. So it's not just second factor, they're now making a distinction between phishable and unphishable second factors, which is really important because, SMS OTPs versus FIDO, well, they're both second factor. Well, they aren't really the same, right? There's a difference. So FIDO fits squarely in there, but it can also get up to the level of assurance level 3 when you start getting into the higher levels of hardware-based security in the device, because level 3 requires hardware-based cryptography. So there's not a, they represent different things, so they don't align perfectly, but they are parameters that you would need to look at in order, so the security levels of the FIDO Authenticator are things you would need to consider when determining which authentication assurance level you're trying to meet. I think we're out of time. Thank you, everyone, for that session. And now I'll introduce the next speaker. Oh, wait, that's me. How did that happen? 1 second, I'm just going to take a sip of a drink. So now we switch into the IoT world. And there was a question at the back relating to IoT and authentication. A few years back, FIDO took a look at what we were doing with authentication and said, can we add value in other spaces? Can we build on what we've done with authentication? Can we build on it with the members that we already have? You know, we've got chip makers there. We've got relying parties. We've got device manufacturers. We got financial institutions. We have a very, very broad set of members. Can we leverage that group? And we have certification programs. Can we leverage that group in different areas? And one of the ones that we came up with is IoT. Now, I'll get into details in a minute. There are variations in, or there are differences in different IoT scenarios, and I'll highlight those in a moment. Let me just jump in. So, first off, we're talking about scale, right? What we were looking at is how to solve the problem of very large scale IoT things. We're not talking about putting 1 or 2 devices. We're talking about things like 10,000 lights, sensors, gateways, you know, whatever they happen to be. It takes a long time, right? Because if you've got to have someone not just physically install it, but then configure each one of those devices, holy crap, holy cow, that's a very long period of time. On top of that, you've got the problem of, well, the variety of devices that are out there. You've got so-called headless devices, right, that there is no UI. So how do you put keys in it? How do you configure security in them? You've got a whole variety of operating systems. You've got a million embedded systems. You've got various real-time operating systems built in. How do they connect? You know, is it, say, Zigbee? Is it Bluetooth? Is it Wi-Fi? Is it a wired connection? And I already mentioned in the previous screen, the manual aspect of installing it adds huge amounts of time, overhead to it. And on top of that, if you've got to have a warm body go and configure each one of them, first off, they have to have some level of extra skill other than being able to manually mount the thing, and they have to be trusted because they've got security keys, whether it's in their head and they're typing them in, or whether it's on a USB stick, or whether they've got some little tool for doing it. There's a trust issue there in that that person can't just be the technician that puts it in. They've got to have some higher level of, well, trust in order to have that, to be able to put in the system and have confidence that the security of the system is good. So there's a lot of things that have to be considered here. Now, there are obviously a lot of onboarding systems today, but most of them are manual. They're slow, they're insecure, they're expensive, right? Talked about some of those. There are also zero-touch systems that are in place today. The problem is those tend to be bespoke. They're custom systems. They're written for specific environments. They're written for particular silicon providers. They're written for particular targeted platforms and solutions. So those don't add value. For those that were in the previous session where I was talking about the benefits of standards and the scalability that you can get from standards and the interoperability you can get from standards, that's what you don't get in these custom solutions that you may build for automated onboarding. So FIDO took a look at this and said, okay, how do we align what we're doing, and FDO is, by the way, FIDO Device on Board, That's the name of the specification. How do we align that with the ecosystem? So we have to consider the cloud service providers, the IoT platform, the ISVs, silicon vendors, the integrators who are dealing with this, and we have to be able to adapt and support a broad number of, looks like we got a graphics glitch there. Those are supposed to be horizontal lines. Sorry. A broad number of connectivity models. So what we're focused on is the area of mass-produced devices, multiple ecosystems, varied distribution channels, because when you're dealing with things like these, the distribution channel can actually become a very important part of the security model, as you have to trust the people that are touching these devices along the way, and the ability to resell and reuse devices after they've reached end of life in your own environment. You want to be able to often pass them on or even redeploy them in another area where you need to maybe reconfigure them to use a new set of security parameters. What we're not targeting here is the built to particular scenario type of situations, the build to order. Those are going to remain, those will have value for certain scenarios, and we're just not trying to target that custom single ecosystem type of solutions. So I'm not going to get into the details of the pieces here, but the idea is that you have a supply chain in place now. You got manufacturers, they pass it on to the supply chain, they pass it on to whoever's going to do the installation. On the operations side, you've got the management software, the cloud service providers, and then you've got perhaps decommissioning and repurposing that may take place, whether for reuse or for disposal. Where FDO fills in is that gap. It fills in or provides the security model for bridging between the manufacturer supply chain and the operations model. And I'll go through the detail of the flow in a couple of slides. But that's where we fit in. That's the piece that we're filling. And the key point here is that we're going after what I call the untrusted installer model. The idea is that this can all be done in a zero-touch way without having to have trust in the people who are doing the physical installation. Not that they're bad people. You just don't have to want to be sharing security keys or USBs with keys with just anybody. They can be installed, they can be turned on, and they can be onboarded. So the approach that we took is we launched the working group back in 2019. Our membership actually grew as a result of this new work. We added cloud service providers. We had new semiconductor vendors come on board, as well as other vendors and integrators that come from the IoT space. So we had all the right parties there. We did a thorough analysis of all the different use cases. We looked at the consumer space, which tends to be more of the trusted model, because it's your home. So having you do things to configure, Scott described a sad tale earlier of having to program his microwave. That clearly is a trusted installer model, where whatever your Wi-Fi password is, like you're being trusted to put that in. We're trying to move away from that model. We don't want to, that was one I would almost say is a device without a UI, because the UI for that is just so hideous. So we looked at a whole variety of use cases, different types of architectures. The goal was to try and build on what was out there already. So what kind of protocols, what kind of security models, cryptography models are out there that we could take advantage of to build this solution. And Intel, in fact, had already built a particular solution they called Secure Device Onboard. And what we did is we used that as a starting point for doing this onboarding. But what we did, though, is we said, okay, how do we take this protocol that was designed by Intel for Intel and general purpose it? Make it open to the web, so to speak. How can we leverage various IETF specifications for data encoding, for cryptography mechanisms? What standard protocols can we use for communication and so on? So we took the spec and we improved it. We added value to it by making it more consistent model with the solutions that are already out there, with the tools and the programming models that people are already using. And this was the basis for FDO. And so where this took us was to the idea of a simple, it drop ships at the place it's going to be installed. You power it up, it connects to the network, and it automatically provisions itself and onboards itself to the cloud. So there's no, once the device has been manufactured, is moving through the chain, there's no reason for another body to actually touch the device until it's powered on at the time of installation. So you get the zero touch, which means it's faster and it's more secure. You no longer have to have, again, that warm body typing things in on the microwave screen. You no longer have to have that person who knows the password for the Wi-Fi on that horrible screen. You got flexibility because the protocol was designed to scale. It was designed to work on ARM and small devices all the way up to big Intel pieces of hardware. So it's a protocol that can be used across the range of ecosystems out there. They can be small sensors, they can be servers. One of the key aspects is this notion of late binding, which connects to the fourth point, which is any cloud. One of the ways in which the FDO works, and you'll see this when I walk through the protocol, is this notion of late binding. Anybody who's using IoT devices needs to connect them to some management system, right? So once the devices are out there, how do you gather the sensor data? How do you monitor? How do you configure? How do you, there's lots of management capabilities that you need. There are lots of tools out there, but they all come from different vendors. You've got a lot of different cloud service providers out there now. You've got Google, you've got Microsoft, you've got Amazon, you've got Honeywell, right? There's a lot that are out there. And the problem previously was that when you built the device, at the time the device was being built, you had to put into it the software to know how to talk to that particular ecosystem. It had to know in advance whose cloud you were connecting to, whose management software are you going to be using. And so one of the really key aspects of the FDO protocol is that it allows for the late binding, which means that it's not until that last step of the whole protocol where the device actually connects to and is configured for whatever service provider is being used at the other end. So it means now that you can take off-the-shelf devices, and the manufacturer doesn't have to produce unique SKUs. One SKU for Honeywell, one SKU for, I apologize, I don't remember all the different cloud manufacturers, but you don't have to produce separate SKUs for each one of them, which is something they had to do in the past. Similarly, the people buying them don't have to say, well, it's this SKU I want, not that SKU, which means that the supply side of things is easier for them because it means if the manufacturer doesn't have to have 3 unique SKUs, they've got 1,000 devices, they break it up 1/3 each. Well, if you run out of one that you need, you're out of luck. So this way, you now have 1,000 devices that are all the same SKU, and they can be sold to anybody who's trying to build the solution. So here's the nasty protocol flow diagram. Does my pointer work? Oh, it does. Oh, and it's green. So it's actually not a complicated flow. It actually is a fairly simple thing. There's only 6 steps. The first step is, in fact, is done at manufacturing. And this is the point at which the keys, and again, this uses public key cryptography, just like the FIDO protocol does. So the keys are burnt into the devices at this point. And what happens is things split. First, the device gets shipped. But then secondly, there's this thing called an ownership voucher that contains information about the key. So again, public key information here, because the private key stays with the device. The next step is that whoever bought the device, as it moves through the supply chain, when it ends up here, actually, so this is the transfer to the owner of the device, that owner's software will register it with something called a rendezvous service, which is a It's another IETF protocol for doing lookup mechanisms, very much like DNS works. Because, again, remember, when you make it, you don't know who's going to own it. So the ID for this device has now been registered in the rendezvous server. When the device lands wherever it's going to be and gets turned on, in this case, it's like a temperature sensor. It's an awfully big temperature sensor. There's another protocol where the discovery takes place between the device and the rendezvous server. And this is where the keys get compared so that the IoT device can now find out how to find, based on IP address or a web address, URL, how to then go talk to the cloud. So this is part of where the late binding takes place, is it doesn't have to know which cloud's being used before it was shipped. It doesn't have to know where that cloud is when shipped. So it gets the location information here, and then this is where the late binding process happens. It's actually a mutual authentication between the two. The device knows that the service provider has the right key for it, and of course the cloud knows that it's the device that has the right private key. So what you get is a mutual authentication, again, using the public key cryptography, like you hear about with FIDO all the time. And then the last step is actually the out-of-scope part of, it's not really part of the FDO spec, which is number 6, which is once it's been onboarded, once the security keys have been exchanged to prove each other, or sorry, once those keys have been used to prove each other, then this is the point at which the cloud will provision a new set of keys that it uses for all future configuration. And now FDO is out of the picture, and the keys that it had are no longer used, can't be used again. The FDO process is designed so that unless you do a full reset, in some cases it can only be used once, if that's a design choice. In some cases it can only be used again if you do a full reset, at which point it would be a new set of keys. And that's it. So it gets set up, the ownership voucher goes to the rendezvous server, the device gets turned on, gets the address from the rendezvous server, lets it start talking to the cloud and do mutual authentication, and then the configuration happens. That's it. Now, one of the things that, again, makes standards more valuable is, again, if you get things like interoperability. And if you have libraries that are available. So the easier it is for a user of an IoT device to deploy, the more easily or the more likely it is that they'll adopt it. It improves, again, security because you have consistent interfaces that can be tested against. And so not under control of FIDO, but in parallel with the spec that we produced at FIDO, LF-Edge, which stands for the Linux Foundation. LF-Edge is a project within the Linux Foundation. They've built an open source implementation based on the FDO specification. Now, I will point out that you may still, oh, wrong key again. You may still see references to secure device on board because the LF-Edge project started before FDO had its name FDO. They're in the process of changing that, and you'll notice even that the GitHub where the open source code is, it still says secure device on board. Again, that one may not change, but all other references and content will eventually be changed to FIDO device on board. So again, this is already out there. It's available today. The contributors are FIDO members. Intel's been doing this, IBM's been doing this, and Red Hat's there. Red Hat, IBM, I think they're the same now. So vendors who are involved in the writing of the spec are directly involved with the development of this open source code. So there's a strong connection between the parties who are involved in both of these. So what are our next steps? Well, FDO came out in the spring. Well, it came out last fall, but through, again, deployments and testing, we discovered some interoperability challenges. So we actually came out with a 1.1 spec that addressed a bunch of those interoperability issues. And now it's about industry awareness, trying to get traction within the industry, helping grow adoption. There is ancillary work going on within the working group to look at how to produce new materials to aid in implementation. So it may not be, it's not necessarily changes to the spec, but providing guidance about how to implement the spec, those types of things. Paul, again, will get into more detail in a bit, talking about certification programs and what we're doing with FDO. And we're also working on vNext. What does need to come next? Do we need to add support for, well, can't even think of anything off the top of my head, but based on the feedback that we're getting, once people are deploying it, once people are actually installing it and configuring it and using it in the real world, based on what we learn from there, it can be new features that they would like to see. It could be clarifications of text. It could be new cryptographic methods. Right? There's a lot of things that we can do to the spec, but that'll be driven primarily by feedback that we get from the general public. And at this point, do we have any questions about FDO? Yes? So the question is, once it's been configured for a particular cloud, let's say, can the device be resold? The simple answer is yes, but the more complicated one is it depends on how it was manufactured. So there are some cases where devices are built to be used only once. That was by design, that was a design choice, and you literally destroy it when you're done because it's configured, you don't want anyone else to reuse it, or maybe it's a reset. In other cases, devices, the intention is, yes, this will be reused by someone else in another environment, in which case the device will have some kind of reset process, and at which point it'll also create new keys that you'll use for using FDO again, but in the new environment. Oh, over here, yes. So the question is, are there HSM modules used by the manufacturers? And the answer is, by some, yes. So again, it depends on the security requirements of the device. How secure does it need to be? In some cases, it's, the public key cryptography is good enough. It may be software-based, but for its scenario, that's sufficient, right? You don't worry about physical attacks maybe on the device. For those where you do, yes, you go in and maybe use the TPM in, if it's an Intel server, you use the TPM as the key manager. So it can be, depending on the usage scenario and how the hardware was built for it. Anything online?
No questions online.
All right. Then I guess we're done. Thank you very much. I know. I got to get a drink. Oh, look at that. So for those of you who have been, persevering, at the beginning of the FDO talk, I discussed how FIDO a couple of years back took a look at ways in which we could leverage our the membership that we have, the mechanisms that we have for doing things into other areas. And so IoT with FDO is one of them. The other goes back to a question someone had when I was talking about FIDO 2, is account recovery. It is a big deal, right? If you're building secure solutions, you want good account recovery mechanisms. The problem that happens some days, sadly, is you use FIDO to do your general authentication, which is great, all the good reasons, good cryptography, and it's unphishable, and then something happens. They lose the device, or if it's a physical key, maybe they lost it, so now you need to re-authenticate them in some way. Oh, okay, we'll go backwards, and we'll use an SMS OTP. Oh, wait a minute. You're going to a lower trust level to try and prove this is the person that used to own a more secure, trustworthy mechanism. It's not a great option. And by the way, this is where value of passkey comes into play as well. But even if you're using passkey, there are times where you still need to do account recovery. So why FIDO and ID verification? Well, this was really the big driving force, is what happens if I lose my authenticator? And again, the statement was written largely based on, what if I only have the one physical key that plugs in the USB port? Or what if my phone is the only device I have that has keys on them? How do I get them back? How do I reassert who I am with the vendor? And so, as I said, the problem was that we went to lower integrity mechanisms for re-authenticating the people to do account recovery than what was with FIDO. Now, a lot of vendors were out there producing solutions. FIDO's mechanism is based on a proof of possession, right? You own something. It could be the authenticator in your laptop, could be an external authenticator, could be your phone. So it is a proof of possession type model. If you use the same proof of possession type model, a lot of vendors are using things like government issued IDs and passports, driver's license, so on, as the mechanism for reproofing, but they're doing it remotely. So they're doing things where, you take picture of the credential, and you do the so-called selfie matching. And while there's solutions out there, there's no consistency across them. There's no criteria for determining how good is that system. Is it good enough? Is it trustworthy enough? Is it reliable enough to be used across systems? And the problem is that relying parties who are looking for solutions like that to help do the device onboarding were stuck, because if they wanted to know if vendor A was better than vendor B, they had to do their own tests. And the systems, the tests that they set up, they would vary. Like, how do you know if it meets your requirements? There's no standards defined for what you might consider to be good enough, right? What's the pass-fail mark for doing that? And often they aren't representative of the real world of fraud vectors. Just because they're doing their own thing, again, these are the sorts of things that there's opportunity for coming up with some kind of standards. Now, FIDO isn't looking at doing, so the solution to all this was we created a new working group called Identity Verification and Binding Working Group. The goal here was not to define new protocols. The goal here was to provide guidance and certification testing. Again, Paul, he's got a lot to talk about when he comes up here. We'll again be talking about in-depth the certification programs that have actually been created based on the requirement documents, testing requirements built by these working groups. And the idea is that we wanted to be able to set up requirements for testing these so-called selfie matching solutions that were based on a consistent set of criterias, whether it's for the document authenticity challenges or face verification, liveness checking, and so on. Again, there are no parameters out there. There are some ISO specifications that come close, but from a testing certification standpoint, there was nothing out there that said, here are the parameters that everyone should try and meet. So the IDWG, Identity Verification Working Group, defined some performance criteria. So how successful does it have to be, right? If you can only authenticate or determine authenticity of documents 50% of the time, that's not sufficient, right? We had to set goals like that. We have a biometric certification program. Again, Paul will fill in the details on that. And what we've done here is very similar to that. And I lost my train of thought, I apologize. So the working group was working to define these parameters. Sorry, I lost what I was going to say. So the first thing that we set up was a set of requirements for document authenticity. So if you think of the selfie matching model where I take a picture of my driver's license and it gets sent up, and then I take a selfie and it gets sent, they want to compare the picture of the person that was taken with the camera with the picture of the person that's on the driver's license, let's say, passport, whatever, government ID. The first step there is to make sure, is it a valid document? Can you verify the authenticity of that document? And so this requirements document that we have define things like levels of sophistication, right? There's a whole variety of things that are out there that are defined, like there are security controls that are built in to driver's license, to passports, and so on. I can't believe how much I learned about fonts and location and all sorts of other amazing things that you don't even realize are built into here. What are the parameters for false acceptance, false rejection, right? How often does it say it's a valid document? How often does it fail to say, how often does it say a false document's true? How often does it fail to say a good document's bad? And the program also had to deal with things like geographic flexibility. We had to be able to define parameters that can accommodate globally, right? We're not trying to define a set of parameters just for one location. The idea is that these could be used, the requirements can be used around the world. So that's the first set of requirements that we created. The second set, and they're published, by the way, they were published last week? Yes. So the document authenticity specification was, document authenticity requirements document was published last week on FIDO's website. The second main piece of work that group is doing is the face verification, so the second half of that. And this gets into, it's kind of a biometric-like thing, but it's a little different because ultimately the verification of the face is not being compared to a template that was recorded previously. So typically with face verification, if I use my laptop, it takes a picture of my face and it stores what's called a template, and then in the future, the camera takes my picture, the algorithm then compares that with the template that's been stored. In this model, what we have is that you've got a document, say a driver's license again, where there's a picture on the driver's license, and in this case, it's comparing the photo that was just taken using my camera with the picture that's been scanned or photographed from the driver's license, and it's comparing those. And so the parameters for testing are different because it's not a pure biometric solution type of test. So it relies heavily on work that's been done in the biometric space, but it has a number of different parameters. And I've gotten a little light on some of this because I wanted to kind of set the context of what we're doing here, because again, Paul will get into a lot more detail when we get into certification. I'm actually not going to take questions at this point because I think more will come up once Paul starts talking about our certification program. And at that point, hey, it's not me. Paul, who is our certification director, will now walk you through our certification programs.
Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Heim. I am the certification director for FIDO Alliance here. As discussed and presented by Scott and David, we have our specifications and we have our requirements. FIDO also launched respective certification programs for those specifications and requirements to create assurance within the marketplace. FIDO has two different types of categories of certifications. We have our product certifications, as well as we have our professional certification program. I'll first begin by going over our product certification programs, and before going into them, I really want to take one step back and look at what are the benefits to certification within the marketplace. There's four basics, and then I'll look at going into what is FIDO's perspective on these four benefits to product certification. We have standardization for industry, market differentiation, regulatory requirements, and then also looking at consumer and enterprise protection. From a FIDO perspective, standardization for industry, you're looking at what is conformant, what is interoperable, and what is compliant. With a specification, we have respective testing that can be completed for that in order to validate that assurance. For market as a market differentiation, there is standing out, making your product stand out against competition. Increased product rigor, competitive nature within the market. We have our security levels, higher level of security assurance, differentiate that product from another product. There's also just that competitive edge as well. To be FIDO certified helps within the marketplace for ensuring what you have produced. For regulatory requirements, FIDO certified also meets compliancy. So there are a number, as referenced by David, like NIST 863. To be FIDO certified does meet some of those respective levels in a similar sense. For consumer and enterprise protection, you have confidence within product quality, security and trust, being an informed purchase, and that applies to both enterprise as well as consumer solutions. And going back to product rigor, certification ensures that the product meets a specific set of conformance and or interoperability testing, as well as security assurance. FIDO has taken an approach for product certification to have 4 core methodologies. We have functional certification, security certification, as well as then FIDO accredited laboratories for third-party testing, as well as we also look at what is certification maintenance and or updates to a product and maintaining that through its life. For functional certification, what is that? Well, it's a makeup of conformance test validation as well as interoperability test validation. For conformance testing, we're testing the conformance of the product to the specification itself, both with positive and negative tests, assuring that it meets the minimum requirements set forth within the specification. For interoperability testing, we're actually testing how well does it do within the marketplace in being interoperable. For something like our user authentication program, for like a FIDO2 authenticator, we're testing it across multiple browsers as well as across against multiple servers to ensure that it meets that minimum threshold for interoperability testing. That's what makes up functional certification. For security evaluation, which is another element as referenced by David, for user authentication, we have multiple security levels. We have, for the security evaluation process, we have a vendor questionnaire, we have test procedures that are outlined within security requirements documentation, as well as there's also our secretariat who's there to verify those claims and or a lab to complete additional testing depending on the security assurance level that one is trying to obtain for certification, and or the validation of the vendor questionnaire from the security secretariat's standpoint. Our FIDO accredited labs program is a special program. We have accredited labs worldwide, primarily within North America, APAC, as well as Europe. Our FIDO accredited labs program includes a training process, on-site audit, and ensures that our test procedures that are outlined within our specification and requirements documentation are properly being administered in order to ensure the validity of the lab report that is then provided to our secretariat for validation prior to certification through one of our various programs. We have currently accredited labs for our user authentication program, as well as for our biometric component program, and for our document authenticity program. We'll also be accrediting labs in the future when we launch our FIDO device onboard program accordingly for security evaluation. For certification maintenance and updates, we have defined a process for completing what is called a FIDO impact analysis report. This applies to any of our product certification programs, and through the completion of the impact analysis report, we'll determine if there is a delta, a derivative, and or is this a new certification that needs to be completed. For a delta and derivative, the difference is defined by major and or minor differences within the product itself. For a new certification, it would go back through the life cycle of certification. Now, going into our specific programs themselves, what do we certify? For our FIDO user authentication program, we certify servers and authenticators. For server certification, what is required is to complete successful passing of functional certification. That's the conformance testing, as well as the interoperability testing for service certification. Now, for our Authenticator program, we require both functional certification as well as a minimum of a level 1 assurance for security evaluation in order to achieve Authenticator certification. For security evaluation, as noted by David, we do have 3 levels that are within that. We have a level 1, a level 2, and a level 3. We also have 3 enhancements to those programs. Anything above a level 1 plus requires a third-party FIDO accredited lab in order to complete additional testing on that based on a set of requirements as defined by our Security and Privacy Requirements Working Group in order to achieve that higher level of security assurance. Those same laboratory reports do come back through to our Security Secretariat, who verifies the reports in order before the actual certificate issuance for certification. In addition, for that level 1, though, we do have a vendor questionnaire. That vendor questionnaire is a self-attested form based on requirements set forth by the Security and Privacy Requirements Working Group. And the form itself, though, is also validated and verified by our Security Secretariat, a specialist within the industry. As mentioned by David, we do also have a FIDO biometric components program. The FIDO biometric certification program is intended to certify biometric components and/or their subsystems as an independent subsystem or a subsystem that would be integrated into an authenticator. Currently, we have requirements established for 4 different modalities. We have face, fingerprint, voice, and iris. These requirements for the test procedures, as well as the PAD and FAR test thresholds, are all defined within our biometric components requirements documentation. The use of a FIDO accredited lab is required for certification for our biometric components program. You go forth, the process would be you apply for certification, you select and engage with a FIDO accredited lab, respective testing is completed on your product, the laboratory report is returned to our FIDO biometric secretariat, who reviews that report, and upon then request of certification, will provide approval and/or rejection and/or re-review for that respective product prior to certification. Very similar for our DocAuth program, Document Authenticity Certification Program. It is intended to certify the process for remote identity authenticity solutions. A use of a FIDO accredited lab is also required, and very similar flow is required for as is done for our biometric components program. For FIDO device onboard, it mirrors very similar to our user authentication program. We actually have functional testing, so there's the conformance aspect to the specification for passing into the conformance test tool suite, as well as interoperability testing. And then there is also at a level 1 security assurance has been developed, a program developed for level 1 security assurance for our IoT security evaluation portion. Higher levels will also be considered for the FIDO program in the future. We have not yet launched the FIDO certification program. We're expecting so later on this year. Moving from product certifications to professional certification. So FIDO also offers a professional certification program. What are some of the benefits to professional certification for being a FIDO certified professional? There is an employee aspect as well as an employer aspect. From employee, competitive advantage, execute projects with increased efficiency, understanding of what are the technical protocol specifications and how to deploy, increased earning potential, validation of knowledge and skills, building professional credibility, differentiate yourself from others within the market. From an employer standpoint, FIDO now provides that assurance for who is a certified professional. Staff with knowledge and expertise, increased credibility within the marketplace, and improved efficiency and risk reduction. There's also an added benefit for employees in the sense of ongoing education and or training that can be provided through a program like FIDO Certified Professionals. The methodology behind this program is twofold. We have an exam. Within that exam, to become a FIDO Certified Professional, you're evaluated on 5 core domains. Passing of the exam is proof of the advanced knowledge and technical skills to analyze, validate, design, deploy, and educate on secure authentication systems using FIDO. For ongoing certification maintenance and updates, there is a FIDO certified program that defines for continuing CPE credits in order to maintain your certification, as well as an annual review process. To be a FIDO certified professional in identity and authentication, you're an expert who helps organize, deploy, and integrate FIDO standards by analyzing business requirements and proposing a FIDO architecture that ensures a secure authentication process. Upon completion of the exam, you get to become part of the FIDO Certified Professionals group, receive a formal certificate and e-badge, put on your LinkedIn, Twitter, whatever social media network you want, agree to the FIDO Code of Conduct, attest to meeting the certification requirements put forth within the policy document, as well as submit annual maintenance fees and complete those annual CPE credits. We launched our FIDO Certified Professionals program earlier this year with great adoption as well as a lot of feedback, and we're looking to turn that feedback into a evolved program that includes potentially more exam options, as well as looking at full training programs to become a FIDO certified professional. Thank you. Any questions? And final comment of get FIDO certified, be it a product or professional certification. Yes. So we cover 4 modalities: fingerprint, voice, face, and iris. And the respective requirements outlined in the biometric components program, and then the policy to becoming certified is outlined within the respective certification policy document.
Paul, we have one online. Is there any place we can find the certification related to, for example, which browsers or OS vendors are supported for a certain authenticator?
Those would be enclosed within the certification details for a vendor to be able to disclose themselves, but are not included within the certificate details that are published publicly. Any other questions? Yes? So I believe what the question is who are the providers, the vendor providers, for providing these document solutions for the certification process, and as well, who would be the reliant parties that are requesting for this? So who would be engaging within the program? So those would be the, from a certification standpoint, what we're doing is we have a set of performance criteria for DocAuth, for the document solution process. It would be the vendors that are providing those respective solutions to our reliant parties. As an example, a bank. So a bank is going to utilize a third-party vendor for their DocAuth solution and or have their own internal solution for document authenticity for the ID verification process. Certification would apply to either the vendor and or those that are owning their own internal proprietary solutions of that portion of the identity verification flow. Yes. Can you, if I'm going to repeat the question, can you participate within the FIDO certification program without being a FIDO certified professional? Is that correct? Yes. So the programs are independent from each other. So our product certifications as well as our professional certification, including in then even a number of the product certifications are independent from each other. So you don't have to have one in order to do another. I would certainly encourage you to become FIDO certified professional though, in general, across the board, through our professional certification program though. Yes. Within UAF, yes. So for our UAF protocol, we have the 3 protocols. We have FIDO2, U2F, and UAF. Within UAF, yes, a peer software authenticator is certifiable.
Question online, Paul. For authenticators that leverage biometrics from a mobile device, how would certification work? Would the device certification be sufficient? I think that speaks to the biometric component aspect.
Correct. So we do have some, we have one biometric component certification that applies to like this example here. For Samsung, their S10 phone, for example, went through the certification process. They went through the biometric component element of certifying their respective fingerprint. And then they looked at it being integrated within their authenticator of their device. The other option is to keep it independent, though. You can go just certify your biometric component or subsystem without the full integration into the authenticator. Yes? So currently we're in review of current feedback for test preparatory and or pre-test materials. Currently, though, on the FIDO Alliance website, you will find a handbook. Within that handbook, are listed out the core 5 domains, as well as recommended references for studying of those respective domains for the testing. The testing is comprised of 100 exam questions, with those 5 domains weighted accordingly, roughly around 15 to 20% per category, plus or minus a few percents there, and covers the general, both business as well as technical aspects of the deployment of FIDO within a given environment. Yes. So certification processes, they vary. So for our FIDO user authentication program, that can span between a few weeks to becoming certified for an authenticator or a server at a level 1 security assurance, to a few months, depending on if you've chosen to go for higher levels of security assurance, and are, for example, engaging with the FIDO accredited laboratory for that additional testing aspect. Our biometric components program is a well-established program that our FIDO accredited labs are very familiar with for testing. Now, as we've moved from the pandemic days, live subject testing, which is required for that program, has helped in getting the certifications back on track And something like a biometric component certification could take anywhere between like 2 and 3 months due to the aspect of the live subject testing, but very well defined within the test procedures for the FIDO accredited laboratories for that program. Something that's new, like our doc-off program. The documentation was just made available this last week on our FIDO Alliance website when we announced the certification availability of that program. That will take anywhere between 4 and 6 months. There is a large preparatory phase within that program to pull together the various document types depending on what you're certifying and what your solution is going to verify against for those test procedures. To become like a FIDO certified professional, you can sign up today. Schedule your exam from the first date of sign up and payment of your invoice up to 180 days out. Once you complete the exam and complete the respective membership documentation agreements, then you become FIDO certified. So very, within that, relatively could be a very quick process.
Paul, we have 2 questions coming in online. First is, what's the recommended conformance testing tool version to run FIDO2 server conformance tests? And are there any known failing test cases?
Ooh, what version are we on? Version 1.7.5, I believe, of our conformance test suite for FIDO2. You can go online and receive access to our conformance test tools. They're open to the public. There is a simple registration form in order to access those. For the server tests, do we have any cases of failure? Was that the question?
Yeah, it's hard to translate, but are there any known failing test cases?
Yeah, failing test cases. So we, from time to time, do have failing test cases for our respective conformance tests. There is an option for being able to submit accordingly your issues, and our certification team addresses those based on when they're received. To my current understanding is we do not have any open issues with the FIDO server requirements, but we are looking to update those server requirements in the near future. Also then respectfully going to update the conformance test tools, as we do for all of our protocol specs. Yes? Yeah, so the test procedures that have been outlined by the IDW, repeat the question. Thank you, David. So going into a bit more detail, I believe, for the document authenticity program, for what those certification requirements outline for the test procedures. For those respective test procedures, we're looking at what the document false accept and document false reject rates are of the document. We're looking at the document type that is being defined for those testing procedures. And we have established minimum sets of threshold for each of those respective error rates. Yes?
Can you explain how on-demand testing works?
So for interoperability testing, we do offer 2 different formats. We offer interoperability events that are defined as a specific set of dates that are scheduled out, as well as we do offer on-demand testing, which is where we utilize our reference implementations in order to complete the respective testing. Depending on where you're at with certification and if you have a product deadline to meet, we do offer that on-demand testing, but we would encourage the majority of those to go through our formalized interoperability events, given the fact that we have a greater amount of reference implementations at those points in time, ensuring market interoperability for your product. Yes? It is not yet been, it's been considered by the our Security and Privacy Requirements Working Group, and it hasn't fallen within a priority queue to develop. At any given point in time, there may be a respective set of requirements that are defined in order to provide that level of assurance. I don't know, David, if you have any feedback or history on that.
I didn't hear what the question was.
For server certification, why do we not have defined security requirements for server certification?
So the challenge with doing server certification requirements is that the breadth of implementations is so broad. The different code bases, there is no standardized interface to the server. How the server talks to the client is entirely up to the relying party. So, depending on which backend they're using, what languages they're using, they're generally all over HTTP, but they don't have to be. There's no fixed target. You can test this, the authenticators, because they have a specific protocol that they have to conform to, and so that you can define the parameters associated with it. It's a lot harder to do. Now, having said that, I would say that most servers fall under the generic category of IT infrastructure, and there are a lot of tools out there for defining security requirements for IT infrastructure. There's a variety of ISO specs. The whole 27,000 series of specs deals with information security management systems. So you're really getting into IT security more than FIDO security as such. So interoperability is our focus.
Any final questions? Okay, well, thank you all. I'll hand it over to Christina Hulka to close this out.
All right, thank you, Paul. So we're reaching the end now of this marathon session. Just to cover a few final points, if you are not a FIDO member and you are interested in getting more involved, there are a number of membership benefits that you can achieve by joining the Alliance. There's an opportunity to engage in all of the work areas that we've talked about today and more. We've had a very technical and certification focus in this workshop. As I mentioned at the very beginning, there's also a lot of discussion going on around the adoption of FIDO and best cases, case studies, as well as recommendations, and also feeding back into the technical development process, the challenges experienced during deployment. There's an opportunity to get visibility into all of the work that we're doing, have that networking experience with other like-minded companies and individuals, and really take advantage of the benefits of discount that come with membership as well, both for certification on the product side and also for the professional side of things and for attending events like these. It's cheaper to come if you're a FIDO member. We have 3 membership levels. The board is the highest. They set the overall strategy for the Alliance. You saw a slide at the very beginning, which I showed with 41 logos on it, all of our board members. There's also the sponsor level, which is kind of the core membership level, to really engage in all of the working groups. It's how we operate is through working groups, and be recognized as a leader within the Alliance. And then there's the associate member opportunity, which is really being able to participate in the broader ecosystem, come and join us at these face-to-face meetings, and get informational updates on a regular basis. These are our working groups. So we've touched on a number of these today. We have groups focused on FIDO2, the UAF, metadata service, and IoT is right there. They're our technical working groups. And then our certification-focused working groups include the privacy and security requirements working group, certification, and identity verification and binding. And then and biometrics as well. And then we also have these adoption working groups. So we have 3 key global focused groups looking at the government use case, consumer use case, and enterprise use case, as well as regional groups. Here you can see we have a number in Asia, as well as a European-focused working group, which is explicitly chartered to focus on the European payment and wallet regulations. So they're very actively looking at how FIDO works with the regulations and make sure that we can be as compliant as possible. And they put out white papers to sort of speak to that and then provide input back into the other working groups. And then lastly, if you have an interest in membership, please go to our website. Everything's listed out there in terms of the steps for how to sign up. We can get you onboarded within a day in most cases. If you want any general information or if you have any questions that come to your mind after you've left to go home from this event, info@fidoalliance.org is the right place to email. We also have a blog and Twitter and LinkedIn, so please connect with us there. And if you'd like to speak to me directly about membership or anything else that you've heard or seen this week, you're welcome to contact me directly as well at Christina@fidoalliance.org. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have or connect you with my colleagues who can answer any more technical questions, which I'm less well versed in. So with that, we've had a lot of questions and engagement over the course of the last 2.5 hours. If anybody has any last final questions about anything that you've heard today or anything that you'd like to know more about, now's your chance. I don't see any hands up in the audience. Is there anything online? All right, in which case we'll be around for a while. Paul, David, thank you very much. Scott, thank you very much. David, in particular for your extended presentation. Paul's first time up on the stage, so thank you, Paul. And yeah, please feel free to come and chat to us at any point in time. We'd be happy to answer any questions or have a conversation with you about your FIDO interests. So with that, thank you very much, and we'll see you around this week.